All right, everybody, welcome. Today we'll be talking about the chapter on Enoch. Um, it has to do with elevation and the types of elevation that Ibn Arabi is making a distinction between. There was something that particularly stood out to me, and hopefully I can find it. I know that I highlighted it, but may not. Oh, here it is. It's on page 85. It's where it's quoting Al Karaz, um, where he says that God cannot be known except as uniting the opposites. Um, and basically, it's only through and in determining them through them. So there is this, I guess, this. Well, the way I understood this is that the only way to possibly reach this unity that he's talking about is by affirming the difference itself. By going through the difference itself, you affirm that unity, um, which would be sort of uniting the opposites. But we'll see how everybody else interpreted it, and everybody else kind of positions and concerns from the text. With that being said, I'll pass it to Jyoti.
Chetan, can you go next?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I'll have more to say as things go on. But this question of elevation actually is extremely interesting. I found it fascinating. I was reading actually that's called Zarathustra the other day with Jyoti and other groups that we have here offline. And he had this. The book starts with this question of overcoming in some senses. The overman, and he's talking about transformation and when you read Arabi, immediately that question gets translated to elevation over here, and the question becomes that are you elevating yourself above God? And he says no. Elevation in itself is a process through which God can be um, thought through and seen and I think and one of the questions that emerged with Nietzsche's that passage on from ape to man, from worm to man or ape to man. There's a passage in the first few pages itself, in third or fourth page, I think. And you start thinking about it, and you ask the question about how do you think through about that passage through the lens of Darwin? And Darwin would have a problem with that kind of a thinking where for Darwin, there cannot be any neutral position from which evolution can be judged. So saying that man is more evolved than the monkey is a problem for Darwin. You know, Man and monkey are both evolved in some senses. That's one of the ways to think about that question, because we both are evolved for different environments. If you place man in a monkey's environment, man is not evolved at all. He'll die. He can survive that environment. Vice versa, if you place the monkey in man's environment, monkey will die. You are all are evolved for your own environments. That's what Darwin is trying to show to us. He's trying to show that there is no neutral position from which evolution can be judged. So then the question becomes: is evolution completely directionless, or yet is there space to affirm direction in evolution even when there is no such neutral position possible post Darwin? And I think that question comes back in Arabi also, when he's thinking through this question of elevation, especially when he's contrasting these two forms of elevation of action, elevation of knowledge. And I would be fascinated to think how are you all thinking about elevation in that context? Are we elevating? You know, and what effects does that elevation have upon us? Are we elevating to higher form? And if it's higher, in what sense it is higher? How do we think through that higher and lower distinction that emerges from it, and so on and so forth? You know? Thank you. Yeah, I think you can, Thomas. I think you can. Yeah, Jyoti, yeah.
Yeah. Jyoti, would you like to go next or would you like me to go next?
You.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. So I did do some supplemental reading because we had an extra week. So I did some supplemental reading from this. I think a couple notes. Let's see. The first one picked up was I also picked up. So I had Al Ghazali's reading the 99 names. So the elevated and the most high. I thought that was really useful. They did supplement some of the commentary in the bezels of wisdom. It helped a lot because the first thing he points out is what do we mean by high, right? As Shitan just asked, the more principal understanding, at least the way that me articulate it, is about causation. So it's not height as in position in the sense of physical higher and lower. It's a kind of causation. I actually didn't like this one statement. It's a high above and below in meaning, not in position. So when we speak about God being the most high, that's what they're talking about. And particularly the reason why Enoch is said to be the exemplar for this is because from Genesis, there's two parts. In the Quran, in the Sunnah for Mary, there's a statement, we lifted him to a lofty station. And then in the Genesis, there's a statement where Enoch walked with God. He was no more. God took him. So that could be that is an interesting passage because that could be understood to be a kind of sublimation or kind of absorbed and basically brought to heaven. So I think the other note is also within the 99 names, at least one tradition of it, is that the Most High also has, it can be translated mean the exalted. It could be the exalted, the most exalt, and the exalter. So there's a kind of interesting framing. There's a potential. This again, I'm using Al Ghazali's commentary on this to build on this point, but I think it is interesting because it's a superlative of most high of high. So one is the kind of addendum is like kind of an added expression of it, and then there's the one who exalts, right, and the one who becomes exalted. So it's about the kind of relative positions. I think it was interesting, and as Javier said about how we're articulating a little better the nature of knowledge from studying this text, actually compared to previous 2 weeks talk, was specifically in the exalter. It's the one that it's an action of Allah to raises the faithful by salvation. It's an elevated vision above the tangible and imagined things, and it raises the intention above sinful desire. So thus raising in rank to be higher in the range of the domain of the angels. So this is a kind of elevation. So when they say with Enoch, it can be interpreted as raising to heaven in a physical sense, but it also means a kind of understanding. So Enoch had wisdom that of a special degree or kind, and that's what they could be pointing to. I do want to point out that I got curious. This is more out of my curiosity because I had an extra week to look at this. Notice this is the wisdom of the holy, right? So last week it was elevation. This week is the holy. So even though elevation is being discussed in this text a lot, the actual topic of question is, or like the naming of what Enoch represents is holiness, the holy. And I also got curious about that, looking at the commentary from Al Ghazali about it. It's not holiness in the normal sense. This is explicitly what he says. He said it's not holiness as a free from defect or imperfection. Al Ghazali had a fun comment about it. He said it would be bordering on an insult to say that, because to deny the existence of something could imply the possibility of it. It's basically like saying a king could potentially be a janitor. I mean, why would you say that? I'm kind of paraphrasing what Al Ghazali said about it. But instead, what the holy is to be free from every attribute, of every sense perception, of all thinking, of all imagination, of all conscious being moved by. It's a kind of freedom from attribution. And I say that as interesting, just as a really powerful point about why is the discussion of the exalted being discussed with the holy here? Because I think kind of the secret of learning and studying the 99 names is not just them individually. They're meant to be in a relationship to try to give you a deeper understanding of the nature of Allah. And the commentary seems to be, is understanding of it is. So remember we said that the raising of rank, in the sense of being elevated, is an understanding, clearing of the aspirations, the desire, the imagination, and the thinking of the person who's submitting to Allah. In particular, the self-emptying that was actually mentioned 2 weeks ago too, the self-emptying property. There's a line related to the holy. The aspirant is as exalted as the object to which he aspires. So that's what he's pointing. This is what is being discussed here. That reason why we aspire to God, to Allah, because He is the holy. He's the only thing that's actually free from all attribution. And also there's links to all the other names too that are actually outside the scope. So the first cause, the first actualizer. So that leads to things like the first and the last, the king, the rich, things like that. So I thought this actually was a very powerful text, not just for itself, but I guess in relation, as Javier said, to the other text prior, and actually also a more richer understanding of my previous reading from Al-Ghazali. And that's my commentary for this round.
Yeah, thanks. So last time it was so good that I finished the chapter right after that reading group, and it took me time to got my bearings. So yeah, that's why. So the elevation thing, and I agree that what we were discussing in the earlier one, Noah, really got fleshed out in this particular chapter. Specifically, the entire discussion that we were having on immanence, and transcendence, and one can then connect it with what I think Thomas and Chetan were talking about in relation to elevation. Also, there's a very interesting discussion going on page 83 when it comes to one, and how do we look at unique. So God as the one, in the sense of the as one, which is like the first of many. Now, the way the discussion is going, and one can see the transcendence, which then becomes possible. And transcendence and immanence are not opposite. On the contrary, it comes out very clearly that transcendence is possible exactly because of immanence. So when he's talking about this distinction between creator and creation, the fact that one is able to have a transcendence is exactly because one has created. So the fact that one had been over there, so one has created, one is present in the creation, one is present in it, and that the fact of being present in it makes the going beyond of it becomes possible. So God can transcend reality, and reality is also unique, but God is in the reality. God makes the reality possible. God is in the reality, and that makes transcending the reality possible. And that's how I was looking at this entire discussion of elevation, which maybe if we can have another round of looking at one, because there is an entire discussion on one and how do we look at the uniqueness of one. And it is exactly this elevation which Chetan was talking about last time about descent. So God can descend also in the creation and can transcend also, because God has created, God was there in the creation, and that is something that made it possible. I also found this entire, which I couldn't really capture much, this entire discussion of uh, cosmic scale and divine scale, because there is a distinction that is coming over here. When he's talking about God as the one in the sense of unique, it is more in the cosmic scale. But when we are talking about one as the first of many, and it's not just unique, but as just the first of many, that then is in the divine scale. But if in the group we can discuss it more, it would help me, because cosmic scale is more of elevation of position, while divine scale becomes elevation in the sense of degree. So yeah, that's it from my side.
So to go back what Thomas was saying about this idea of freedom of attribution. In the beginning of the commentary of the text, the introductory note to this chapter, he talks about that holiness, the root word. Oh man, I forgot what the root word was. It was the root was the Arabic root word kadasa, and that translates to be far removed. To be far removed. So I did like that idea of that when we're talking about holiness, that there is this aspect of to be so far removed, right? Like we have to really think about what this elevation means. But something that something that Jyoti said about transcendence and immanence, it kind of it kind of reminded me about what I wrote today. Is that when we talk about the creature, or maybe even like a structure, any type of structure, or any type of religious structure, is that anytime the thing tries to define itself either by what it is and what it isn't, it always, by doing this, it always points beyond itself. And so I think in this way you can kind of see like how transcendence and immanence actually interact, you know. Like it almost happens in the same movement. The moment you start defining what this structure does, or what this creature is, or what this creature does, you're saying also at the same time what the creature isn't. And by stating what the creature isn't, you're pointing beyond the creature itself. So that means that there's room for elevation. There's room between this space. Now the question that Jyoti posed about, I think we said cosmic scale, cosmic scale and divine scale. I'm not sure if the examples on the numbers would help. Because I found his commentary on the numbers, one, a little random, but kind of helpful, to where I guess maybe on a cosmic scale, everything is only relatively unique, which would portray why there is something that is ultimately unique, because the names themselves carry not only the particular, but also the essence of the name. And so I think acknowledging that in tandem with the numbers, which I thought it was fascinating the way he did it. It was like all these grouping of numbers are a grouping of ones essentially, but they all exist because of one, but one in itself is just origin. But I'll be really fascinated to know what Chitan thinks about introducing the negative one. This notion of negative one. I want to know how that would interact with what Ibn Arabi is talking about when he says that the number one. But there is the other thing that gave me some thought is that what does it mean to have this relative elevation versus self-sufficient elevation? Because the only thing that I got a grasping about was towards the end of the passage of relative elevation. That relative elevation would mean that, Ibn Arabi throws the example of like you're holding a position of office, but it doesn't mean that you are the wisest man. But then also means that you're holding the position of office is also contingent on you holding that position of office, right? So that elevation is completely contingent on that position. I think there's room to think about, to be honest, it kind of reminded me a little bit of like Hegel's dialectic, a little bit. And I'll tell you where I'm getting this from, in the sense that when Hegel says that the master wants recognition, right? So he gets the slave to have some type of recognition, but ultimately he never gets the recognition that he wants because it's a slave. And if he either annihilates the slave or so on, then again, he never gets the recognition. Anything that he does never gets the recognition, really. unless there are like, two masters, so to speak, until he recognizes himself through the other. And so I think that this self-sufficient elevation is what it's pointing to, about that you're not being contingent on you're not falling contingent to like some relative elevation. But I guess the only way that you could do this for Ibn Arabi is go through some type of like self-annihilation, where the self-annihilation is the self-sufficient elevation, because God himself is the name, is elevation itself. But yeah, I'll pass that along. I guess we'll just go back same order. So, Chitan.
Yeah, hi, wonderful. In fact, Thomas and Suti and Javier. Um, uh, where do we sort of start thinking? Of course, on the question of -1, one can immediately start seeing that Arabi is actually giving a very nuanced thinking on the very idea of one. A lot of times when we enter into, say, certain postmodernist forms of thinking, we tend to dismiss one in favor of multiplicity. We tend to take one in opposition to multiplicity. And I think Arabi very very nicely is at some level breaking that opposition down. She's showing to you that how one is necessary for the multiplicity in some senses, and he's trying to give you a very different thinking on one another. And then as we said last time also, like, I've said it many times before that, but to think that even in psychoanalysis, Lacan's real is not zero in that sense. It's not emptiness, it's not simple nothingness, or like Hegel's thinking is simply not of zero. It's a thinking on negative one in that sense. So one actually reappears through its opposition, and then we need to think about that that kind of a question in that sense, that do we need to rethink the one today that in a different way? Yeah, and that remains to be a philosophical problem, that in trying to think multiplicity, in trying to think difference, have we sort of overestimated or overlooked the importance of one in thinking through difference in some senses, and how do we think through that kind of a question? The other, I think in my other translation, there's a line over here which is interesting. From this point of view, there is no relative elevation in this world. However, aspects of existence have different grades. Relative elevation exists in the unique essence when it is considered many aspects. For the reason we say regarding him that he is not he and you are not you. I'm just quoting it. So immediately one can see that we need to think of elevation in a different, and that is what that comes from Darwin also, as I said before, that we need to think of elevation not simply in terms of elevation higher than apes or higher than insects, and then but rather thinking of elevation simply in terms of you know in some senses committing to a certain process through which human becomes something else, so we become something else, and that process which is always on, which is a process that is, I'm also thinking of this wonderful work done by this biologist. I'm not right now remembering the name of the biologist. What's the name of the guy? Um, any of you remember that person who has done this work, who has shown to us that evolution actually does not happen in any linear fashion, in that your eyes did not evolve, or your language did not evolve, in the sense that first smaller parts got evolved and then bigger parts have been getting evolved. It didn't happen like that, like you would make a machine today. How it happened was that something was being used for some one purpose, and suddenly something happened and it started getting used for another purpose, and suddenly some other part of it gets evolved, and so on and so forth. The evolution never happened in a directed form. There's no direction to evolution in that sense. It always happens through certain chance encounters with an organism with its own reality, in which things take one turn, things take another turn, things take, And so I remember Chomsky's account of language evolution actually was that meaning first and foremost was not connected to form in that sense. Meaning was only there for your bodily organs to participate with one another. Suddenly something happened and this form and meaning came together for a human being, through a chance encounter, and you had this capacity for language. So that I think that's something we need to think about when we are thinking. When it's interesting, because a lot of times these debates actually go in saying that a traditional understanding of evolution or traditional understanding of elevation and all of these things actually is not able to think through these kind of questions. But if you read people like Arabi, you'll immediately see that they have those insights there. They already are thinking through those problems in some sense, which is fascinating. Now, I think on question of numbers, actually, I think it gets much more tricky, because I think this is where Arabi gets into his mystical sides also. One has to become conscious of that. I think if you read Jung, for instance, Jung talks about the importance of numbers in their mystical dimension. That each number signifies something, and And I think one way to read these numbers thinking is to read it like Arabi is thinking about names. There's a continuity over there, yeah, and he's trying to show us that there is something about numbers, that they function like you're thinking about names, as attributes to God, and so on and so forth. And we can read relevant passages to think through what is he doing over there. Yeah, in that sense, especially when he's giving you that set of numbers. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 20, 30 till 100 and 1000, 20 numbers, which are, I think, very important or something of that nature. How do we think through those kind of thinking? I think I'll just stop here, and maybe next round we'll get back to thinking about numbers, and maybe read some passage and see. Yeah, Thomas, please go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
It was funny on my notes for the numbers section. I was like, this is fascinating because, it's funny. I actually, I think normally the answer would be, 1 is the answer. It's funny because actually I was thinking, as Javier said, I was thinking of Yushaitan and I was thinking of -1. I was like, shouldn't the real number in reference to God be 0? Because that actually is the absolute origin that even identifies, gives existence or identity to what's positive and negative numbers, for example, and everything else. And also in computer science, 0 is considered a counting number. It's counted as a thing that exists. So it seems like 0, and actually it's interesting because 0 then has those interesting properties, because when it's multiplied, everything comes back to 0. But when you add with 0, nothing happens. It's as if nothing happens, but it was always there the whole time. So also, by the way, just a fun side note, I was reading The Greater Hippias from Plato. It's a fun section because I'm just bringing one point, because there was a thing. It sets up this Hippias is this very famous sophist who claims he's so intelligent and so beautiful, and it sets up that he's a genius in math, in counting and geometry and all this stuff. And you're kind of like, what's going on here? Why is he setting up? Why is this being led to us? We come to the end of this section where this character Socrates is basically making Hippias a fool by showing he can't even distinguish counting between when he says, so you're a 1 and I'm a 1, correct? He's like, yes. So then together we're 2. Are we 1 or are we 2? It's a very straightforward kind of math question, and Hippias blows it up instantly and screws it up. So it's funny. So it's almost like it's a passive commentary to say this. Look at this fool who thinks he's so arrogant, he's so intelligent, but he can't even count. And he claims that the Spartans can't count, but he can't count himself because he can't identify when 2 are in a group. Are they even or are they odd, for example? That's also why I thought the idea that I was meditating on that, thinking that really 0 is actually a better number to talk about when we talk about God in that sense. I think the other major note is there's a discussion, right? I also bring up the 0 because of there's a section where the hot and the wet, again, all these contraries all need to go through an origin point of some reference of the contraries. They say that all these are just relative to the absolute value, which is, by the way, one of God's names is the measure. So thus again we see another. This is not said in this text, but I could see instantly how that name for God connects to this, which is, by the way, something they're closing in this section. They're talking about how one name points to all the names with one who has wisdom to see it. So I'm just giving examples of where I see that happening. These names all have it embedded within them, all the others. It's just how easy can we articulate them? Very similar to virtue. The idea that when you have one virtue, do you have all the virtues? It's a very classic medieval question. They come to a very different answer in the West. And the Aquinas come to a very different answer. To say that, for example, the intellectual virtues, you can easily have them and not have the moral virtues, for example. So you can have justice, but you might not have temperance, as an example. Actually, no. Let me clarify that. Actually, that's a moral virtue. I shouldn't say that. No, it was actually the sciences, basically having scientific knowledge, for example. Like, just because you have that doesn't guarantee you moral virtue in of itself. That was what Aquinas said, if I remember correctly, reading that section. Yeah, I think that covers my notes, because also I think that discussion of the zero is how to articulate the unity question that Jyoti had as well. That's all for me. I yield.
Yeah, actually, when I was wondering of zero at that time, that why didn't he choose zero? So yeah, well, it's interesting in this group. This always happens. So yeah, I mean, the question that I was asking, I just got like a way out, and I will talk about it. So the difference between the cosmic scale and the divine scale, and elevation of position, elevation of degree. When here you are talking about relative elevation and self-sufficient elevation. It's exactly like the place value and the face value. Of any number that we have been discussing about. So when we are talking about the self-sufficient elevation, of course, this is something that is happening at the divine scale. So no matter which office you are holding, so you might elevate in terms of the office that you are holding, which largely is in the cosmic scale. But in the divine scale, which is more to do with the relative, self-sufficient elevation, which then is about the divine scale and the elevation of degree that is there. That's how I was just trying to think through. Also, Javier, you talked about an interesting thing which one can see in Hegel and again in Nietzsche about this elevation and annihilation, which we have discussed earlier also, that how there is certain kind of annihilation which becomes necessary even to move from one station to another. So from ape to human, how this thing becomes important. So when we look at Zarathustra, and I was thinking, so Zarathustra descends to man. And in the descent to man, which I think is very important for all of us, because to understand immanence and transcendence, which needs to have the feature of descent. So he had to descend to man because, of course, what is the purpose of all the knowledges? What is the purpose of the sunlight when he was talking to the sun? If to whom it is reaching, if it doesn't reach to those people. So the fact that who is receiving, to whom are these knowledges? So all of it comes. What I was thinking even while reading Zarathustra, and I think it also comes out in this Ibn Arabi, is we have Zarathustra and we have this old man who is like, there is a descent over here. Unlike when we look at Platonian cave allegory, we have a person who is like, there is an ascent over there. So the man who actually got the knowledge was inside the cave, was inside this dark cave, and then he broke the chains, and then he came out and he got the sunlight, and he realized that it's like up there. But over here, what we see, which is coming in Ibn Arabi also, is a certain kind of descent that is happening, which one can see even in Nietzsche's ideas and readings, where it is important for this overman to become the human, which I thought is also related to this idea of annihilation, which I think if we can have a discussion around death drive, and how there is a certain kind of death that becomes essential for any kind of movement that has to happen ahead. Yeah, that's it.
It's so funny that you talk about annihilation, Jyoti, because I was reading some of Freud recently. I think maybe I'll grab the text, because if I read it, it'll make much more sense as I connect it. So bear with All right.
Which
So,
text is this?
so I have the Penguin Reader, the Penguin Freud
Freud.
Reader,
Freud.
but in his the outline of psychoanalysis, he talks about how, for example, he says right here, it says, it is only when the individual is totally in love that the main quota of libido is transferred on to the object, and the object, to a certain extent, takes the place of the id. So what I called this in my notes, I called this annihilation, because there is this idea in mystical writings that if you love God with everything, then you basically self-annihilate. Like God basically enters into you, which I found I found that very interesting that Freud wrote that if the libido becomes so invested with the object that it is possible that this investment in the object sort of takes over the id. I mean, yeah, the ego takes over the ego. So that's that's my comment on that. I'm pretty sure maybe Chitan and all you guys will have something else to say in response to that. But yeah, I thought what you're saying about this annihilation elevation. There is something else that was brought up. I don't know which one of you said it, but there is this idea that I start thinking when we start making the distinction between manyness and one. No, manyness and uniqueness. What I think is sort of ironic is that we don't consider that manyness is unique in itself. Just the idea of manyness points to uniqueness by the very fact that it is many. And that it is a problem, that we make it a problem, but in fact it proves its own uniqueness by being many. So I thought that was an interesting way to sort of think about when we talk about, when Ibn Arabi is trying to sort of explain this oneness and manyness. But to kind of go back to what Chitan was talking about with numbers, I figured that I would read some of the text here on page 86 about numbers. I'll read the big section where it begins on page 86. It says, the essence is unique while the determinations are various. This situation is well known, since every man knows this of himself, being the form of the reality. The realities are mingled, some with others. The numbers derive from the one according to the well-known groupings, tens, hundreds, etc. Thus the one makes number possible, and number deploys the one. Furthermore, enumeration is possible only because of the existence of that which is enumerated. The latter may exist or not exist, since something may be non-existent physically, but exist intellectually. Therefore, there must be number and that which can be numbered, just as there must be the one to initiate the process by which it is itself developed. Each unit is a reality in itself, like 9 or 10 down to the lowest 2 or upward ad infinitum. Although none of them are comprehensive, each of them being a particular collection of ones, 2 is unique, and 3, and so on. Even though all are one in being made up of ones, nor does a particular number embrace other numbers essentially. For the fact that all numbers are collections of ones establishes at once that, as being different collections, they are relatively unique, and that, as being all multiples of one, they derive entirely from the one. Inherent in all this are the 20 groups, and then all the numbers, according to a particular construction. Thus, in saying that all numbers are one reality, one must also say that the one is not the numbers, being the origin. So, yeah, I do like this idea about how Ibn Arabi's kind of like making this distinction between like number, I don't know if I'm understanding correctly, between like number and one, and the fact that it's because of one that makes all the other numbers possible. But it does, I don't know, I would like to see how does this difference that Ibn Arabi is kind of showing us, how can this be translated to like religions, for example, the questions of many religions, the questions of so many different positions of political authority and everything else, despite the fact that I know that we've already addressed the elevation part. But with that, I'll end there.
Thanks, Javier. Yeah, I think a number bit. At least I think one thing I think comes to me on that paragraph that Javier just read, and I wanted to read that paragraph, myself. That what he's trying to show to us is that each number essentially can be constituted by one back again in some senses. And then Thomas also gave us this part whole kind of a game that one can always play. That 10 is also a one in some senses. Because the one is simply the question of where you want to start your counting from, and that can become one, and you can start from there on, and so on and so forth. And then you can again divide that one into two, and again you get that one back. In some senses, because even if you divide the one in two, again you get the one back. Because then you get two, because when you have to count two, it starts from one again. There is something very, 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 very one is to think philosophically about this problem of one in some senses. That how do we think through this relationship between one and two, or one and many in some sense? I remember I was at a linguistics summer school quite a few years back, a decade back almost. Where one of the professors over there actually was trying to think through this question of one and two in language, and his essential work was in showing to us that language doesn't there's a lot of doubling happening in language. So his claim was that there's a lot of hidden doubling in language happening, which we cannot see on the surface. For instance, just to make my point clearer, so when you have a verb phrase, if we understand, so when you say Chetan went home is a verb phrase, Chetan is the noun phrase, subject position in that structure. His claim was, for the subject, this sentence to be formed in this manner, there has to be a doubling of the whole verb phrase happening within itself. And whether the doubling becomes visible to us when we use structures where we have a big verb phrase and a small verb phrase. Structures like where you're using aspect and tense in that manner. For instance, when you have to put sentences like Chetan has been going to the party every day. So has been going. So where you put all of when you draw the syntactic map and you ask the question, where do you put all these different? Has is also a form of verb. Been is also a form of word. Going is also a form of word. Where do you place all of them? And then suddenly you realize that structure always doubling within itself was just not visible on the surface. I'm just giving you a very bad example. I don't know. He has a very interesting book called Syntactic Doubling. You can search at some point. I'm just letting it be there. What I'm trying to show to you is that and he was trying to argue in that sense was that there's something fascinating about this relationship between one and two within the linguistic thinking, that language always can find means to double, and it can also hide that underworld within itself, and you can find simple structures existing on the surface, and you can engage with them, and there's something of that nature that happens in reality which we are not able to think through. That our idea of one almost always at one level is a mirage, and at another level, without that necessary starting point, you can't have any idea of other numbers. which is why one is essential, which is why simply thinking that we start from two and we ignore the one doesn't work. And sometimes we do argue in that sense. And I've got a friend with whom many of us arguments go where, an argument starts from thinking, oh, everything is difference. There is no singularity. In that sense, there's nothing, which can be. I mean, yeah, and the problem is that within that argument, immediately when you say there's no singularity, you have to come back to that every singular thing is unique, and again the one becomes important in some senses. And how do we think through that kind of question? That's I think one part of the story. The other, I think, Jyoti's discussion of divine and cosmic scale, I think, has some interesting elements there. I think this question of divine and cosmic. I remember, and I'm just stretching myself a little. I'm not. It's not necessary that I would make sense here, but I'm connecting. I remember long back when I had some interest in occult practices. There's a notion of ethereal plane and astral plane in most occult practices in some senses. The idea is that you'd always find that human beings don't only inhabit one reality apart from the physical world. And I think most religions incorporate that idea in one form or the other. And it's an interesting question to think about, that in what ways does human beings start to think about his relationships in the physical world, and those relationships cannot be simply accounted by the physical world itself. It needs something else to, if you ask a shaman about the ethereal realm, he'll tell you that those are realm of spirits, and then he'll give you another realm, he'll give you 7 realms, whatever. I'm not saying there are only 2. I'm just saying that one is never sufficient in itself, in that sense, to think through that that kind of a question. And how do we think through these different planes that exist for human beings to make sense of the world around them in that sense. Yeah, I'll just stop here. Thomas, please go ahead. Thank you.
I think the main area contributes, I can say from what I heard from this, is the sections related to Adam and Abraham. It's probably the building point. So first on the Adam point, there's a comment. It's on page. You want to follow along? Let's see. That's on. Yeah, these are actually both on page 87. So he created from Adam's soul. It's made. This is really to Eve, so that Adam's consort was nothing other than his essential self. For him, from him came forth both mate and child. For the creative command is one in multiplicity. So this expresses the idea, right? One of Javier's comment about the many is unique. So this is the comment that, well, yeah, the creative act is one in multiplicity. I think it is important also to make a distinction between one of the names for Satan is the scatterer, right? So that's a multiplicity without any unity. There's no one at all. So it just knows that just one clear distinction there. I can write my notes about that. But with that said, there's like expression of how numbers being expressed with Adam is talking through. From Adam came Eve, and from them together, so out of the one came the two, and out of the two came the multiplicity, right, of their children from that point on. And then actually with the self-annihilation part was telling the story of Abraham's binding of Isaac, as this is actually really powerful, right? That the essence of the Father is the Son. This is fun. This is some fun little Christian games here being played here. It's a little fun. But the point is that by binding Isaac and sacrificing Isaac, and Isaac being subservient to it, right? So that commentary, do as your commanded, Father, it's showing that Isaac understands. The saying is that Isaac understands his identity as the essence of fatherhood by being the son. It's because fatherhood is only expressed by his son. It's a fun little quasi-nominalist argument on what a father is, right? because it's in a relation. It's not an existence in itself. Pretty fun. But that's so by Abraham choosing to sacrifice himself, that's basically what's being said here. So that's how by being a father and being commanded to sacrifice that's what we may way to express what we mean by this. When the aspirant is so willing, loves God so much that they're willing to toss away their essential essence of what they think they are. Of course, God plays get fun and then changes the form of Isaac to be a ram instead. Whoopsie daisy, switcheroo. Always fun changing of the ending of the story. You don't tell you that in this text, but that's something that can contribute what I'm hearing. It's just a way to connect. Because numbers are always so abstract. How do we understand it? I think the next passage is about Abraham and Adam are useful to understand what's trying to be said here.
Yeah, I mean, in continuation, I also realized that this discussion of creator creation and the way Father, Son, and he is talking about Adam, the analogies of both of them really help us understand. I want to read something where exactly Javier stopped, and this is page 86, last line. Whoever has understood what I have said about the numbers, namely that to deny them is to affirm them, will know that the transcendent reality is at the same time the relative creature, even though the creature be distinct from the creator. So something that we were just discussing about Father, Son, and the immanence and the transcendence. And to affirm two, you have somewhere to deny one. To affirm three, you have somewhere to deny one. But to deny one over there, to affirm three, exactly means to affirm one also, which then is to do with this discussion of the creator and the creation, and what I think Thomas was just reading about Father, Son as well, which I guess it fits the puzzles about the discussion of creator and creation and the kind of descent which is required whenever we are talking about any kind of elevation which is there. Yeah, that's it right now.
So I guess it's that funny thing, Chitan, where it's like you can't deny singularity and still pretend to affirm difference, especially when we start talking about this. But I guess that's what I like about Ibn Arabi, because he's making you really think about, how we think difference. And I guess the problem with the fear is that one can't affirm one, and one can't affirm both at the same time. But I think it's because of the manyness, right? That it is unique. That if you really affirm difference, you affirm singularity already implicitly. Like the difference itself becomes the singularity. That's how I would say. If you really want to affirm difference, then you are already, if you take it seriously enough, you're already affirming the singularity. But your questions on thinking about, the physical world and different realities, the one way that I've been thinking about it is something that I've already previously said, but I think it's useful, at least for me, is that when we start talking about the physical world, we already have to sort of define what physical is. And the moment that we start defining what physical is, we start defining what physical is not. And that notness, that whole realm of notness, in my opinion, is what points already beyond, it points already to another reality. Just by affirming the physical world, you are already pointing at what is beyond the physical world. Just because you are always saying what it is not. You're saying this is physical, this is matter, this is that. And every time you say that, you're also saying what it's not. So I think there is room to kind of, play around and say that, yes, there are other realities, because we're always sort of pointing beyond it when we sort of define it. And I think that's what's useful about Ibn Arabi's numbers, is that the moment that we deny it, we affirm it. I think that's probably like my favorite line. The moment that we deny it, we affirm it. Now, to go back to, I thought this was really interesting about the Abraham and Isaac example, where the Son is the essence of the Father, if I read that correctly. Kierkegaard does an exposition on this himself, right? But the way Kierkegaard handles this, he's saying that, well, what Abraham did, it just makes no sense. It has to be the most absurd thing in the world. You know, it has to be the most absurd thing in the world to just have faith about what God is telling you to do, to sacrifice your son, right? And there is no other logic other than it's like this absurd reality. But I think right here, Ibn Arabi kind of tames. I wouldn't. I'm gonna put it this way. I think he elucidates how absurd it really is. It's absurd in the sense that Isaac is already the essence of the Father. So that means that Abraham is only actually confronting himself in this very moment. He's not. There's nothing being done to Isaac. Isaac is already the essence of the Father. It's Abraham that is struggling with himself in this case, if I understood that correctly. So I guess that's the thing that leads me to this other conclusion of the more experiential side of the manyness and the oneness, is that how do we consolidate or reconcile this idea of alienation when we encounter difference? There is this funny thing, I think, that we are encountering another, so to speak, but actually I think when we look at Abraham and Isaac, is that Abraham is confronting himself. And this kind of reminds me of like the Jungian notion of like the shadow, right? Like anytime I confront a person and I sort of dislike their behavior or strongly dislike their behavior, it's not really, it can be them, but really that deep-rooted disgust is sort of rooted in my own unconscious. I think there's something to say about that, how the manyness goes back into the one. And that every time I confront another person, I'm always at the same time confronting myself. So it's like the same game that Thomas did, except I'm doing it more psychologically. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, no, I'm so different from you. I know I'm so different from you. But actually, when I'm saying that to the other person, I am saying it to myself. To sort of affirm my unconscious that I am so different from the other person. But yeah, with that being said, I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Javier and Thomas and Jyoti. Jyoti, that was brilliant what you just said. Actually, I think we can read another passage at 88. And I'm reading this from here. I'm reading from in between actually. If the form be a synthetic form, the perfect man it embraces essentially the essential perfection, since it is identical with the universal location in which it is manifest. The all-embracing totality inherent in the name God is implicit in that form, but is at once not He and not other than He. One can see this problem emerging. That it is not God, and at once it is also God. One can see the problem as 1 and -1 as we think. Abdul Al-Qasim, he alludes to in his book, The Shedding of the Sandals, where he says every divine name is invested with all the names. And this is something Thomas pointed out. Because every name implies the essence as well as a particular aspect it implies. Therefore, insofar as it implies the essence itself, it partakes all the names, whereas as evincing the particular aspect of the essence, it is distinct and unique. In its later sense, it is differentiated from every other name, such as Lord, Creator, Factor, and so on. In the former sense, name is essentially the one name, but other than He is representing some particular aspect. And you can get back to, I think, thinking from here what we've been discussing about one, and then Thomas has actually, I think I've already read this passage in some senses, or in I think these lines from his notes also. What we're trying to actually think about over here is that how one, Rumi has this line where, you say that each drop actually includes the ocean within it, form of a thinking. The challenge actually, as I said, is to think the part-whole relationships when you need to think one. And in what ways does and part-whole relationships get formed in our thinking about, because what happens at each point you form a whole, those holes can get represented within the parts themselves again, and each of those parts constitutes its own reality. It's not like each part are somewhere, and this is what was coming in evolutionary thinking also, when I was trying to point out that, that biologist, I can still remember his name right now, but that evolution doesn't take a straight path in that sense, that each part actually has its own unique existence, and yet it plays a role in forming a formation of a whole, and each part includes its own whole within it itself. And how do we think through this kind of a structure? I remember in Elenka Panchek's What is Sex, she talks about what you call the matryoshka structure, where she tries to think through it, in the form of those dolls, where each doll is within itself, and when you can start, then you have those dolls where you put one doll within until the end, you keep on taking out, each doll starts coming out from it. When we need to think about something of this nature, we need to start thinking about reality in that kind of a problematic, in that sense. Yeah. And that's, I think, one part of the story. The other, I think, I wanted to sort of start discussing also with you this distinction between evolution and degree, and evolution and position, action and knowledge. I think that Jyoti mentioned initially, and I would like your thoughts upon that also. Yeah. Thank you, Thomas. Please.
By the way, so we've been talking about multiplicity in one compared to like others. I mean, by the way, this applies to us as one individual too, because there's potential and actuality at every single moment. Because think about it. At every single moment, we're existing, and we could be doing a bunch of different things too. Counterfactuals could always be pointed out. Our body can be different positions, can enter different states. So actually, within ourselves, we are a multiplicity in a one, just because of the interfacing between actuality and potential between just in one individual. We don't even have to go to other people. You can use yourself as a reference point. So just the stat, and that's the point, is that also remember from the Chittick commentary, like basically the first book we read. Remember that diagram about the physical reality, the imaginative, the world of imagination, and then the spiritual reality, right? So that's another, again, domain. These are like, so instead of the multiplicity being anything, you don't even need the other in a sense of other physical things. There's also the other relative to you at every single moment of your existence. This is why in Islam there are some schools of thought, right, that have this kind of what's the name of it, school of thought that basically God's creating every single moment, because you need something to thread every single instance of reality together, and God's basically constantly creating. There's one school that's not the oldest schools. One school says that. I forgot. My mind's blanking. I'm tired right now. But that's just the main note I wrote. Just hearing this, what Javier was saying. Also, by the way, I get in debates with people about this, because I always say that you have to acknowledge reality beyond the physical reality, matter, by the very acceptance of probability and potential, because that by definition means things, counterfactuals, could happen by some probability, by some, whether it doesn't matter if it's not somebody chance or not. It just points out that other realities are possible. Yeah, multiple worlds. Take your point, how you want to frame that. But I just need to make the claim that people who are pure materialists, who say there's only material reality, there is nothing else, I don't know how to understand. You cannot then use probability in your arguments then, because probability has all these presuppositions built into it. That is something. The real is not just the physical actuality. The real is also potential, at the minimum of the physical, let alone more the world of the spiritual or the imaginatory in nature. I've gotten some arguments about that, because then they just sit there and give me just definitions of what probability is, just counting. But then I got to sit here and tell them, well, what exactly are numbers, my friend? Are they physical things or are they something else? Anyways, I'm just going tangents of debates that I've had with other people. Yeah, I think that's all I have for now for this cycle. I think we can start circling over to Jyoti's general questions about the divine and the cosmic order of creation. Well, I'll yield for now.
Yeah, I think it all what I think Thomas is talking and what we all are talking about, how manyness goes back to one. And when I was reading Father Son, I was reminded of Khalil Gibran, and there is this very interesting thing that he has on children, that your children might have come through you, but they don't belong to you. So the fact that they have to one, and I found it resonating with what we are talking about and what Ibn Arabi is saying, and in the sense of manyness being in one, the fact that yes, in the son the essence of the father can be seen, but exactly to affirm it one has to deny it, which means you have to let them go as well. And when you allow them to go, only then that essence can also shine, also further is able to hone itself, which we can also see in this entire discussion we are having on creator and creation, and also the elevation in terms of position and degree. What is also coming in this discussion of creator and creation, some underlying ideas, whatever is the reality. I think Ibn al-Arabi is also trying to point about that even if there is this even if this elevation, self-sufficient elevation is happening at the level of the divine scale, we cannot really be dismissive of the cosmic scale also. Or maybe, I mean, the way I would talk about reality, there is certain investment that is very much required in reality. So for instance, if we think that we can go to the hills and there can be like elevation of degree which can be possible, no, not necessarily. That is why I think this discussion of creator and creation, what is it that creator has created, and in the creation there is the essence of the creator can be seen, and that descent is required for any kind of transcendence, which then is indicative and instructive of the fact of an investment which is also required in the reality. The fact that even if reality, even if it has come out from the creator and creator is in it, one has to work in this world also, in the real world also, to be able to transcend it. So the descent in it is becomes required to be able to uh, uh, transcend it. Yeah, that's how I was trying to read it.
Actually, I think that's perfect, Jyoti, because the idea of this elevation through action and then elevation through knowledge by seeking degrees, it's this. I think it's this. There's this careful danger about kind of always separating one or the other. Um, and I think what Ibn Arabi is trying to say is through this action and seeking knowledge thing is that you can only understand, and I'm really stretching here. I feel like that you can only understand the oneness of being until you do that action that leads to the knowledge itself. That you cannot just, it's possible that you can already be in a position of knowledge to sort of understand it, but it's not quite the same if you also do the action itself to sort of transform that understanding into a sort of this constant becoming. So that way we understand that action and seeking knowledge are ultimately the same thing. But we have this tendency to separate the two and say, he's doing something and I'm just, here thinking abstractly and, whatever. But I think it's important because I think Nietzsche's Overman is is the concept of this, in my opinion, is the very concept of this. That every time that let's put it this way, in a Nietzschean way, is that once you reach a certain level of knowledge, you go through action to come back down. You descend down to tell them what you have learned. And then once you have told them what you have learned, you then go and move past it, right? I believe at like the end of Zarathustra, he's talking about amor fati. It says, after this you must just go on, right? You must move past it. So there is this idea that action and seeking knowledge work together, but only in this way that we don't create some type of cheap oneness of being. Essentially, it cannot be a oneness of being that is not without work, essentially, without any qualitative understanding. I think you could say that what Ibn Arabi is trying to avoid is probably the philosopher's God. I think that is possible, that he's trying to avoid the notion of the philosopher's God, where you have to incorporate this idea of action, but action cannot be separated from knowledge itself. So I think that's why I like this idea of elevation. But I think when you combine those two elevations, you actually get what he was eventually talking about, this elevation of self-sufficient, that is self-sufficient over relative elevation. So in my mind, it almost seems like Ibn Arabi is doing this process of, he's actually talking about a oneness that is a process, a oneness that is moving. And the reason why I get this hint that this oneness is moving is that when we talk about holiness, it is sort of out of our reach. It is always out of our reach. It's kind of like what Thomas had said in the beginning, right? It is this freedom of attribution. I think that's a static way of looking at it, but when we start thinking about movement, is that it's such a movement that you can't pin it down. You actually can't give any attribution to it. And I think that's the kind of concept of holiness that I'm getting. And so I think there you can actually understand why the overman is always the bridge, is always the bridge, is always the in-between. He is consistently the bridge. And yeah, so that's kind of like my comments on that.
Thank you, Javier. I think on two things. I think one is, I think, thinking through Thomas's potentiality and how potentiality is present. Agamben has very nice passages on it. There's a very nice lecture of Agamben on YouTube if somebody's really interested in thinking. I remember reading this, thinking about this question of power to potentiality. So, for instance, when you have an authority figure in front of you, we forget that power doesn't only function through what he actually does to you, but what he can do to you. Your relationship with him is structured not only through what really happened between you and him, but what potentially could happen. So in that way, if you start thinking about potentiality, is always structuring the actuality in that sense. Even if it never manifests itself, it never actually happens. And how do you understand that kind of a problem? And that's I think a lot of times we think that potentiality is something which only occurs, or which only has a probability for, as Thomas is saying, it only has a say upon what when it actually happens. That's not true. By the very fact of it being potential, it starts structuring your actuality in some senses, without it actually in some needing to manifest itself. That's I think the first kind of a question that needs to be thought through in that context. The other actually is this question of action and thinking. I think the challenge of thinking action is, in some senses, that how do we think. I remember Idris Shah having this very brilliant phrase. I think it's written by him, or it may be some other Sufi thinker that he quotes. To live in the world but not be of the world. He creates that distinction. The idea is that how do you live in this world by not collapsing completely into this world? in that sense. And that's the challenge with action in some senses, that how do you act without completely collapsing into action? At some level, that how at what point do you completely collapse into your own actions, and that there's no gap left over there. There's no engagement with the authentic contradiction between them. And I think Hegel's thinking about, and we can go back to Javier's comment about the physical world in that sense. I think Hegel's thinking about matter and idea essentially was this problem there. So Hegel was a very unique idealist in that sense. Hegel wasn't trying to think of idea in opposition to matter. He was not saying that the world is made of ideas and not matter. No, Hegel's column was let's take this question of world being made of matter to its end, and he says that if you take it to its end, you realize that matter is just another idea. Matter is not freely given to you. It's not at all obvious that everything is made of matter. You understand that to reach to this point of saying that this table and this iPad and this pencil or something else is made of the same substance itself is a great leap of idea. It's not something that you should take for granted. How did you reach there? How did you reach to this wonderful realization that all of these things are made from the same substance and they comprise of the physical world? I think that's where the challenge, essentially lies. That at what point do we, and that is where the philosophy of materialism actually has taken that route. That at what point can you articulate materialism, without completely collapsing into matter in that sense, without actually completely encountering that collapse? And that is the same challenge with action. And how do you? And Hannah Arendt has wonderful writings upon thinking about action in that sense, and she's trying to warn us that fascism essentially emerges from this collapse into action. When you think, to act is in itself is a beautiful thing. Without thinking, we should all be man of action. There is some kind of a danger in that, in that movement. Yeah, I'll just stop here and give it Thomas. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shitan, for picking up my comments about potential and running with it so well. And I know, I think the power possibility angle is just one example, like one demonstration of the idea. I really do appreciate that. Also appreciate always a fun refutation of materialism by just saying you don't even have to go to Hegel. You can just go to Aristotle. Matter always comes with form, always. So just for that reason alone, whoopsie daisy, your little your materialism doesn't go so well. But for that reason, you have to explain what form is with the minimum. So one thing about action, because I think the big surprise rereading this text again, remember, so last episode, there was this, right, the setup of position of action and knowledge with position and degree. Remember the whole thing about trustee and regent? So there was a whole little mapping between that last time too. So you're kind of getting a set of what you think you're going to get. And then you get this last paragraph where it's saying, oh, actually, by the way, it's actually none of that. It's neither position nor degree. So then what is this? So now we're stuck, because here's the thing. Javier, just one question. Maybe it's the combining, or is it the exclusion of both? Is that even possible? I want to point this out because remember, for every thought and for every action, there actually is a third move of the will. The will has to assent to the knowledge and to the action. So I'm just pointing out that I just remember this from way back. I think it was from chapter. I think it was Adam. I forgot. I remember when, but remember there was a discussion of what is freedom and rationality have to do with each other. And I was positing some comments from Aristotle about choice, and I made a comment about specifically with the mysteries of what the religious was studying for theology supposed to give us. Right? Is that freedom to be moved by the mysteries? That's what I'm wildly stretching with an argument here, but maybe the way I'm thinking about this is what he's getting at. If he's saying it's not action and it's not knowledge, and yet he generally is a positive. He gives a generous comment at the end, like, "Oh, actually, if you self-know yourself with real knowledge, it doesn't matter their position gets lost. You still have it." Granted, but he does say point blank, it's neither. Actually, in the real substance of the matter. the only thing I'm left with, if I have a model of a 3-tier movement of action, knowledge, will, and then action, and then I'm left to the will as the only thing where it was not excluded or said not to be. So then I'm saying that what I'm proposing is that what he's getting at, remember the idea of the aspirant man who's the aspirant for the holy is to remove all things other. So it's to be moved by these mysteries. So it's basically a moving of the will, of the rational. That's basically what it means to be a rational creature, is that we have a will. Remember, because angels are rational too. They're spiritual entities that, if you follow the traditions of Islam and Christianity, makes a devil from an angel is their move of their will to disobey God. That's what made them fall. So that's more of I posit that. Is that robust? I have no clue. I'm just positing from memory of last conversations and thinking through what is getting at here when you're setting up a dichotomy and then telling us that actually it's neither. That means there's something underneath we need to dig up. So I bring this to the table just for us to think about. I don't have a definitive answer, but I'm just posing a fun idea. That's all I got for now.
I'm not very sure of what I'm saying, but these are just some random thoughts. So in this discussion we are having of potentiality, actuality, and this creation and the creator, and the fact that creator is able to transcend exactly because creator is in the creation, and this immanence and transcendence and manyness in one. One can also see what I think we were just discussing about shadow, the value of the shadow, which Javier was talking about, and the regression that Freud has also talked about. So when your shadow can be your virtue, and one has to be careful about, I think there is this parallel with the idea of a descent over here. So the fact that creator has to go back to the creation is required for the creator, like for overman, for any kind of transcend, for any kind of elevation to happen. It's like, it's like in terms of simple physical sciences also, even when you are driving a car and it goes back, when it has to go back for in any way to start again, or to go uphill. And then it's to do with the entire important. Maybe I never thought like that. This is the first time I'm trying to think like this. The value of the regression that is there. We all look at Freudian regression in a pretty. At least when you go through it in your own personal life, you don't. It's not. There's nothing fancy about it. But the fact that going back, if for the really there's nothing fancy about creator and the creation. There might be, but of course if there is the God, and the God bits can be seen in all of us, yet however one can see that there is the baseness to us also. And that baseness, and that's where I'm talking of potentiality. I'm trying to think of potentiality and actuality. So the potentiality it's not just about the potentiality to be the overman, the potentiality to ascend further, but the fact that the potentiality to descend is also very much there. And it's not just there, but maybe it is essential as well. It is pretty much necessary to be there for any kind of ascent to happen. Otherwise, that ascent is not possible. So the fact that, it's like William Blake, the fact that you see evil in you and the potentiality of the evil in you. Somewhere that potentiality of seeing the evil in you also is essential for any kind of actuality to be realized, that yes, you can transcend it as well. Yeah.
So now you guys have me talking about potentials. Thank you, Thomas. No, I thought that was a good point, Jyoti. That in essence, the potential can be looked at as something that it has to exist in order to allow ascendance or descendance, anyways. Ascending, to allow it ascending. And then what Thomas has said, but there's a third thing, this idea of the free will. Because I think what I've always found interesting when we're talking about opposites is that there is always actually, and this is something that triggered when Thomas was talking about this, is that it is true when we're talking about opposites, there's always something that is actually a third in the conversation of opposites. And to give like a very tangible example of this would be like when C.S. Lewis talks about good and evil. The very fact that we have concern about good and evil already implies a standard for good and evil. That is the third. The third is that we fervently believe in a standard between what is good and what is evil. So it's never just a polarity of good and evil. There's always a third. And actually, I think Thomas can help me quote this too. What is it in Islamic? I think it's in the Islamic Hadith or Quran that it talks about between a man and a woman, there's always a third, right? It's like shaitan or something, right? There's always a third. So I'm actually fascinated by this idea of a third. That I think this can help us think about actuality and potentiality, like Thomas had alluded to. That and I I want to say that the uniting of the opposites, maybe the uniting of opposites is acknowledging the third, having the capacity to acknowledge the third within the involvement of the opposites. I think this is a useful way of approaching opposites, that it's never just one or the other. It's one, another, and another. But the thing is, we have to realize what that other is when we're talking about the polar opposites. And again, I think the hint that I got was when we talked about Adam. It already talked about three. It says it was Eve and the child, right? The woman and the child. So, yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts about this. If we start thinking about this third other, or maybe we don't have to think about this third other. But I thought Thomas's point on free will kind of alluded something like that. The other thing that I would respond to elevation, having like ultimately no, there's it's neither action and knowledge. I think another way to sort of interpret it is that the elevation is so exaggerated that it is no longer, there's no distinction anymore. There's no distinction at all. So it would be kind of like false to kind of go for either or. I feel like that's another way to interpret it. But with that, I'll pass it on. Will it be last round?
Can you explain more? Why do you say that elevation is like it is overrated so much that what was the statement that you just said that
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that it is so, to kind of go at the introductory text, it said that the Arabic root word was like kadasa, and it was saying is to be far removed. So basically, what I'm saying is that elevation can be so elevated that it is no longer what it is, no longer elevated. Uh, it's basically that idea of like the transcendence and the immanence, But yeah. Achitan? Oh no.
Thank you, Javier. Yeah. I think what you're discussing is the problem of triad in that sense. The Hegel's knowledge of spirit actually emerges from this question of three. And again, when you start thinking in these in these terms, you're again thinking numbers in some senses. And if you take your logic seriously, one becomes two in Hegel and two becomes three at all points of time. And one can start thinking the relevance of other numbers also, for instance, 5, 7, that kind of a. I think it's the last round. Maybe we can read the small passages from the starting of the book, on page number 84. As being the pivot of the spheres, as regards position, as to degree it belongs to heirs of Muhammad. You know, God says to the elevated ones, and God is with you in this evolution, since although he is far above all position, he is not so in respect of degree. I think this discussion between position and degree is what is the difference between these two things? When a soul is concerned with activity fears the loss of attainment, he follows with his saying, he will not nullify your deeds. For action seeks position, while knowledge seeks degree. You know, God unites the two kinds of illusion for us: illusion of position through action and degree through knowledge. And I think the question of unity, I think Thomas has already addressed it. But I don't think we have actually discussed what is the difference between these two forms of elevation, essentially. And I think there is something to be said about that when we elevate ourselves through action and when we elevate ourselves through knowledge, we can see that they both are not entitled to same forms of elevation in some senses, in the sense that you can find people doing a lot of right action without having without necessarily saying that they should have corresponding knowledge for it. There's no necessity for that to be the case. It may be the case. I'm just saying that there's no necessity for it, and vice versa. Knowledge, there is no prior guarantee that is that knowledge would always find its elevation in action. And finally, it has to unite at some level. We can have that kind of a discussion. The other question is that in what ways is God nearer to us through degree? I think that's what he's saying, na? Rather than position. And how do we think through that when he says that he is far above all position, but he is not so in respect of degree. That in one term he's very close to us, in other terms he's very far. And how do we think through these two, I think, two domains of looking at approaching God in some senses, and what are its conditions and so on and so forth. I think the discussion that maybe we continue in the next chapter and so on and so forth. I don't know. Let's see. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you everyone for, I think, a fun conversation. I think it was like, I have to say, I think we really kind of came to full speed at the end. I think some really fun insights from this text. So thank you everybody for being together tonight. I think Jyoti really brought it in tonight at the end with his comment about the shadow and because remember the whole pretense here, right? The one with real knowledge has understanding of himself, so thus it's not relative to anyone else. But remember, the kind of meta theme of this whole text is basically through knowing oneself, we know God. Or better is that that's the point, is that really when we actually find the real identity of us, it's actually God. And the better statement is actually, especially when Jyoti said, is that actually we're capable of failure, defeat, sin, error, take your pick, right? We have all these deficits, all this lacking. We're the lacking one. That self-awareness of the lack is that awareness about it. And actually, a real mature understanding of oneself requires acknowledgement. It's actually one of the biggest areas of ignorance you find. The kind of people I actually get nervous being around are the ones that say, "Oh no, I can never do anything harmful. I would never hurt anyone." Actually, I think that's self-deception, 100%. Because that means that's not the person I want to be with when something bad happens, because they may surprise themselves what they actually are and not what their ignorance says what they are. Anyways, I think probably the closing point, one is the idea, right, of the unifying, right? These the contraries are unified, and also just because to put any of these names to God is a little weird in one sense. Because remember, these are, as I said in this text, these are really, I think the names are more tools of understanding for us than anything about God himself. Because the only name he actually really has is Allah. It's no different than, I'm Thomas, that's Javier, this is Shaitan, and that's Jyoti. Right? Your proper noun names are really who you are. It's a name identifying who you are. Anything about me being the speaker and you all the listeners is just something that's describing me and describing you all, but it's only in the moment of useful. It's only useful in a certain context of framing. I do think actually just talking it through, this idea of drawing out, I think, because remember, God's actions, will, and knowledge are all distinct entities of names, right? The names of God attached to all those. The will has not been discussed very much, and I kind of leading what Shaitan said. What next chapter is? I believe it's about Abraham, and I think it's about love specific. So I think it's in love traditionally has been the movement of the will to desire the good of another. So I think this hinting and drawing out of to will as the bridge between action and knowledge. I think that be articulated and fleshed out in the next chapter. So I look forward to reading that. That's all for me. I yield.
Yeah, I think I'll read this chapter again to have more clarity on this elevation of position and degree, because this discussion is really interesting. The paragraph that Chetan just read, the paragraph after that, again on page 84, it's interesting. And Chetan finished in this one. He's not so in respect of degree. And now, I mean, over here it's he, which is not so in respect of degree. When the soul in us concerned with activity fears the loss of attainment, he follows with his saying, he will not nullify your deeds. For action seeks position while knowledge seeks degree. Now, this I found important. God unites the two kinds of elevation for us: elevation of position through action and of degree through knowledge. So, the fact that, again, I'm going back to, and Thomas really honed it well, we are the people of failure. We are all lack and all, and how that becomes essential for any kind of elevation. So I feel there is always this kind of celebration of divine level, elevation of degree. But how for that, the other one is also extremely essential. The fact that one has to invest and work at the cosmic scale or at the level of elevation of position also. It doesn't make much sense, but I always wonder. Okay, we talk of self elevation and all those things, but we also pretty well know that at times you want like exact external conditions also to be amenable for any kind of salvation, for any kind of upgradation at the level of the divine scale or at the level of degree. I have friends who can like really think and or do a lot of things, but simple things, the fact that you have the fact that they still bother and worry about the real world and simple monetary issue, home issue, financial issue, and it's really it does have a say on the not necessarily, one can't say that, but even that becomes essential. And to me that then is to do with the regression is not really the right word, and maybe I don't know why Freud used a word like regression, but that's kind of stepping down becomes essential. If that means the stepping down to the reality, to the real world, the fact that I want this kind of officer position, however, I don't know, I need to think more about it, the essentiality of it. Also, three has always fascinated me, and some time back I read one of the quantum physics book, and the way the triad and all of it is given this special value really satisfied me at the personal level, because in class 2 I learned the divisibility rule of 3. Any number, how it can be divided, and we all know about it. And since then I see a number and I have a compulsion to divide it by 3. And I still don't understand why I do this, but when I read it I was like, okay, fine, it's not as abnormal as I have been thinking of. Yeah, thank you everyone.
So I think there's some really good points that Jyoti, when you read that part about when the soul in us concerned with activity fears the loss of attainment, I think there's room to say that actually, because there's a common theological debate when we talk about salvation, that there is this idea that one can reach salvation by doing something about his salvation, and then there's the other side of the argument that says that you can have salvation just by sort of affirming or believing the doctrine itself. This you can see more in the Christian mindset, that this debate happens. Now, there's some that would say obviously it's both, and I think that Ibn Arabi is kind of pointing to that. But I think what helps me think about this idea between action and this idea that God is already near me in degree, but not in position. I think what helps me is that, for example, when I give you guys that story about, I wanted to reach enlightenment, right? I wanted to reach enlightenment, but the paradox was that you cannot reach enlightenment if you are striving for enlightenment, that enlightenment is already sort of present. So then the real question is like, how do you work through that? But I think what something got further clarified for me as we were talking about this is that, and we can extend this just a little bit longer because I wanted to hear your opinion on this, is that I'm trying to distinguish the difference between when he said that on the bottom of 84, after the perfect man, he says, he is elevated either because he occupies a high position in the cosmic order or because he has a high degree, the elevation residing in them and not in him. So I'm curious about that subtle distinction between it's an elevation residing in them and not in him, unless he's referring to because I want to say this passage is specifically talking about the perfect man. But yeah, I think I know we haven't talked about this, but I want to say that there is a suspicion why I feel that a lot of mystical texts talk about that you need to be in the present. There is something about this nowness that they keep talking about, where it sort of encompasses the actuality and the potentiality at the same time. And I can't explain why I feel that way or why I feel like that occurs, because I feel like a lot of the spiritual practices kind of focus on that presentness, which is something that I'm still trying to think out. What was I going to say else? Yeah, I mean, it's just leaving me at this point. So yeah, with that, I'll stop there. If anybody has last comments, then yeah. Okay, I guess we're good.
Thank you, Javier. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah. All right, that was a good talk, guys. And we'll end it there.